Okay, I will share my screen. All right, hi everybody. Welcome back to this session and this workshop on podcasting. So this is the kind of second installment of it. So last time that we met, we talked a lot more about kind of the softer things and kind of the initial steps to creating a podcast, which were things like what kind of format, how are you going to name your podcast, how are you going to look at your audience, and kind of the initial building steps. And I had presented kind of these 21 steps to building a podcast. So just as kind of a preface, none of these steps necessarily have to go in order. It's just kind of the different things that I've been able to identify, and other podcasters who are professional podcasters have also identified. So today what we're going to look at is more of kind of the recording and kind of the harder skills, the tech skills that you need for podcasting. And one of the things that I just want to identify is that within the podcast that I do, so the Book Women podcast, which we talked about extensively in the last recording of this, and kind of the preface and the premise of this podcast is that when it comes to the actual hard skills of the creating your podcast, that is not just generally something that I do a lot of. That's mostly what Tanya and Sheila, my co-hosts, do. And they've taught me a lot about how to actually do the recording and have given some tips. And I will share with Deanna some of just kind of our tips and tricks for using some of the tools that we have within our own Book Women files and things that we had to learn ourselves as we were kind of going along. So I will send those along for when everybody is creating their own podcast and becoming creators. So one thing that I did leave off on was talking about podcasting equipment. And we talked about this in the last recording. However, I did want to share some of the tools that we use and that I have bought for the indigitization program at UBC, and that I would actually add if I had the resources and the funding to my own podcasting collection, because it does make a difference when you have really great equipment for recording. So like I said, we got started on our own phones. It's an easier way of starting. However, the sound quality is not always the best when you're recording on your phone. So when it comes to podcast recordings, well, one of the things that I really like is Zoom products. So Zoom does have their own products, and Zoom, not like the web app Zoom, which we are meeting on today, but Zoom, the company that creates recorders. So Zoom does have a whole section for their technology on podcasting. And one of the things that you can buy are lots of different tools for podcasting. So you have the PodTrack 4, you have your audio mixers, so the PodTrack 8, the L8, and then you also have the Zoom recorders. And they have many different Zoom recorders with different functions, different capabilities, different levels of cost, and for folks with different needs. So at UBC, we actually have the H4s, which are not listed on here, but we have 2 H4s in our podcasting pack, and then one of the H6s. And so with indigitization, if you do have one of these Zoom recorders and you need to learn how to use it, because they aren't necessarily intuitive on how to use, we actually do provide through Indigitization's website an open source toolkit on how to exactly use a Zoom recorder to create audio and to get audio. And so I will also share that link for this open access toolkit that you can use to learn how to use the Zoom recorder. Additionally, with the Zoom recorder, one of the things that we've purchased are these podcasting mic packs. And they're really nice because it's a great microphone and a great set of headsets that you can also connect right up to the Zoom recorder so that you have clean sound and you can hear everything yourself. All right, so back to the recording. All right, so recording and editing software. And so this is your big thing for kind of your podcasting, is that we want to be able to record and edit in a way so that we're getting really great sound quality. We're taking out all the things like ums and ahs. We're able to stitch together our audio if you have multiple tracks, and we're able to have a full recording. So what you'll need is pretty much some type of tool that you can use to edit your software for your audio, edit your audio through this software. So Audacity is usually a really great kind of intro level editing tool, and it's free, it's open source to use. So Audacity's platform looks like this. You can sign up for Audacity. It's a really great tool. We use Audacity for the Bookwoman recordings. What we do with Audacity is we use the single track function, and we lock our recordings together with the single track function. This way, the edits that we made this way, all the edits that we make to one recording, for example, like taking out any pauses for breaths, any ums or ahs, anything like that, are done throughout the recording. And when we stitch it together, it allows for that. So it also allows us to have fuller sound within the recording, and it makes it sound like we're actually using proper recording equipment instead of just cell phones. One of the things that you need to do and that you can do with programs like Audacity is that you can remove any type of environmental sound. And environmental sounds are kind of things that are happening in the background. This is kind of in general for podcasters. One of the trickiest things is that when you're podcasting, you want to be picking up voices and people talking. You don't want to be picking up things like a car honking outside. For example, my washing machine is going right now, so you'll probably pick that up in this audio. If we were recording a podcast right now, we would have to get rid of that. I talked about in the last recording, this is often why podcasters podcast in studios, in booths, in silent rooms, closets. Sometimes you want to be quiet. However, with the Bookwoman podcast, we don't take out all of these sounds within Audacity, because one of the things that we like to think of is sometimes these environmental sounds that we have are there extra guests on our show. So if you hear kids in the background, other people talking, these are what we like to think of as an extra guest, and it's something that we consciously do within our recordings. So with Audacity, one thing that I will share is just some tips and tricks, and I will send the links and these files, is things like what to do when your headphones are not working within Audacity, the preferences, how to make changes, as well as within Audacity, things like we have leveling out sound is a big one and can be a little bit tricky. So we have a YouTube tutorial here that I will send the link for on how exactly to level out the sound, as well as you can download an audio leveler as well, and that will help you to edit then within Audacity. As well as within Audacity, you can add your music to it. So it's not for just editing the audio tracks that you have, but it's editing your whole entire recording. So we use music as our opener and our closer within our podcast. So we have to add the music to it. So here I have tips on how to add your music, and as well as here just for consistency when we are doing our podcast, how exactly we will do it. So, begin phase at 10 seconds, music for 15 seconds, fade for 5, just so that it's consistent. And then the edit will look a lot like this within Audacity, so you can see it clearly. And I will share these tips as well along on how to add the music. So additionally, with Audacity, there's other tools that you can use. L2 used to be a free editing software. Now you can get a trial for it. It is not necessarily free anymore. So L2 is like Audacity. It has a few different kind of functions within it, but it is now charged. So it is not an open source. So there is a monthly fee and a yearly fee. However, they have a really comprehensive demo. So one thing that I would do when you're actually looking at a platform to be doing your editing is look at the functions, watch the demos on how to use the product, and then whatever seems the most comprehensive for yourself. Like I said, for myself, I'm not one to do the editing within our podcast, so I need something that's a little bit more intuitive. So if you have some type of funding, you have the capacity to actually buy a year-long subscription, a monthly subscription to a podcasting editor and maker, then definitely feel free to check out other platforms than Audacity. However, Audacity has just been the one that has worked the best for us. All right. So the next step is scripting your show. And so we can edit our shows. And like I said, we don't have to go within order for this. So scripting your shows. So this is one thing that I had to think about on whether or not to actually talk about how to do a script, or whether or not you should actually incorporate a script into your podcast. And I think this is a big question for a lot of new podcasters, is how exactly do we talk on our podcast? Do we read off of something, or do we just go naturally and talk fluidly within our recording? So we do not script for the Bookwomen podcast. The farthest that we go for scripting is just actually providing our guests on the show with some type of questions before they come on, or writing questions for ourselves just to get, unless we get stuck with what we're actually talking about. So often we don't get stuck. We don't have a lot of massive pauses within our podcast, but sometimes those pauses can be a good thing, because sometimes you need those pauses when you're editing. So one of the things to know about scripting is that if you do script your podcast, often it can help you remember what you are talking about or what you want to talk about. This can help in some cases if you tend to kind of run on with things, or if you're somebody that rambles a little bit, it can keep you a little bit on track if you're scripting your podcast. But one thing to note is that unless you have a lot of practice podcasting, you have a lot of practice with working with media, and with speaking in general, then it can sound a lot like you're just reading a script, like you're just reading and you're not actually, you're not animated, you're just simply reading. One thing that you can do for kind of scripting is sometimes when we're having our opener and our closer, so most podcasts will have some type of an opener, you can script your opener and closer just for consistency. However, sometimes you will need to change it a little bit. So like our opener and closer, I normally do it, and it's usually goes along of the lines of, hello everybody and welcome back to Masinahikan Iskwêwak. We are the Bookwomen. My name is Kayla and I am here with my fellow Bookwomen, and then Tanya and Sheila will introduce ourselves. Then we introduce the person that's coming on. So that you could script if you can't remember your opener and closer. Our closers, we don't normally script because they're a little bit more fluid. We talk about the next episode, but those are not scripted. So if you need some help just kind of remembering, how you're going to open up your show, then you might want to have that as kind of a scripted part, or something that you even record separately from the show, depending on what exactly you're opening or closing with. So scripting is kind of a personal choice. It's something that we do not do. We like ours a little bit more fluid, and like we're just sitting around a coffee table, enjoying each other's company is normally the way that we roll for that. Additionally, talking into the mic can be a really something that new podcasters need to learn. Okay, so one of the things, like I've said, is that you need to be in a quiet space when you're setting up your room. You don't want a lot of people talking around, a lot of interruptions, even though those do happen, and that's okay. Especially if you live with other folks, you have pets, you live, like I live downtown, it's noisy. We were interrupted many times during the recordings for season 2 when I was here in Vancouver, because there was lots of protests happening downtown and you could actually hear them from my apartment. So we'd have to stop the whole recording because of the environmental noise outside, and there was no way for me to block it out. So when you're talking to the mic, you want to be close to the mic. You'll see in the last recording, I actually had my podcasting mic with me. And one of the things that I can do with that podcasting mic is talk fairly close to the mic without actually like touching up against it. And it has a little protector. You want to pretend that you're in a conversation with yourself or the mic, if you're doing a solo show. So if you're talking to other folks, then you want to be having a conversation with them. But if you're doing a solo show, it's easy to pretend that you're in that conversation with yourself or the mic. Don't worry about the ums and ahs or any types of breaks in the sessions, because those can always be edited out. And like I said, sometimes those pauses can actually be really great because they add in kind of a buffer for editing. Because if you're having to edit out really small changes. Like if someone goes, and then immediately starts talking. So especially like myself, I'm a fast talker. So that can be really hard to edit out that without actually clipping out another part of the audio. So taking breaks is completely fine, and talking a little bit slower. And one of the things you want to do is create a persona when you're talking into the mic. So we want to be ourselves and our authentic selves, but often you'll notice that people begin to create kind of like a persona when they're talking. And especially this is important for us within the Book Women as 3 women that sound at some points kind of similar. We want to make ourselves as unique as possible without changing who we are. So we need to talk in ways that listeners can differentiate one from another, and you'll notice that. So I like I said, talk faster, and a little bit. I say a lot of ums and ahs, but you can usually tell the difference between Sheila, Tanya, and I by the tone of our voice, kind of the sassiness that we have going on. And it can get really funny at times, as well as the slang that people use. And if you have any kind of accent from where you grew up, I have a little bit of a weird central Alberta accent that comes out occasionally. So you can usually differentiate us because of that as well. But talking into the mic is something that can, it comes with practice, and it's completely fine to even set up a mic and do a few little audio tracks that are kind of test tracks, just so you get used to the audio equipment and the recording equipment as well. Remote guests and hosts is something that, especially with the Book Women podcast, that really changed from our first season to the second season. And most podcasters will have some type of a remote recording or remote host. So for us, when we came into the second season of the Book Women, we had to start relying on remote recording tools, because we were all living in different provinces. It was COVID, but we still wanted to interact with guests and each other. In season 1, we had the privilege of being able to actually meet with all of our guests and sit around the same table, but that's very rare in podcasting that everybody is actually there together. So with remote guests and remote recordings, mostly for our seasons, we actually use Zoom, and we use Zoom for different reasons. So we don't release the video of what's going on, but we often do meet guests over Zoom with the video on. This way, when we're actually using the Zoom, we can look at each other, we can read facial cues from each other, we can look at other things, as well as we can chat back and forth with each other privately if something's going awry, we need to change the subject, we need to move on in the conversation, or we forgot to ask a question, anything like that. So what we do is then when the Zoom recording is over, we just choose the audio file and work from that audio file within Zoom. We've also used Skype before. Skype recording wasn't as intuitive. Zoom is usually our preference, but we did record over Skype with Norma Dunning when we interviewed her. And it is something that you can use. If you have some funding for your podcast, you can also use Ringer. And so we used Ringer for season 3 of the Book Women when we did the book club for it. And so we got funding and we used Ringer because we wanted to try it out. And Ringer is a way of doing conference calls through kind of a link, and you can invite people and it will bring everything together as one recording. So it's really nice because you can actually see the elapsed time, as well as you can see the audio of other folks on the call. And then it just downloads to your computer. So it's really easy to invite people, and you can have as many as 4 guests, and that's all we needed pretty much within this conference call. However, like I said, you do have to pay for Ringer. So if things like funding are an issue, then it might not be the easiest thing to use. The one thing with Zoom, though, unless you have something like an institutional license, is that or you pay for an upgrade in Zoom, is that there were before the pandemic limits on how long you could use a Zoom call for. they did relax that, but I believe now it's up to 45 minutes again. So if you are having a longer podcast, then Zoom might not be the best. And recording in other ways might be the best way. So using something like Ringer and just paying for a monthly license for it. So Ringer was what we used. We liked it. It was fairly easy to use. And we just have not gone back to using it because we have not recorded a new season, but we probably will be getting a Ringer subscription for the next, for season 4 when we start up again. All right. So editing your podcast. So editing your podcast, I've included a link here to Audacity University. So editing your podcast is actually one of the things that will take up the most amount of time usually, other than the initial sitting down to record. Your podcast is the actual editing for it. And so it can take, depending on the quality of the recording, how many guests were on it, as well as kind of the interruptions within it, just the quality of the recording. It can take a very long time to edit one episode. Some episodes are easier to edit than another. It can also depend on the guest. So we had guests that were easier to edit than others. Some guests kind of go all over the place. As well as there's just some days where Tanya, Sheila, and I were off in our recording, and it took a while for us to edit those. So I've included a link here for Zoom University on how to edit your podcast, what you want to take out, what you want to leave in, all the tips and tricks to editing your podcast. And I've also included some links, and I will send those out for everyone on how to edit and how to kind of like create really great recordings. So music for your podcast. So this is always a big thing when you're kind of thinking about your podcast. How do you want to open it? How do you want to close it? Do you want to incorporate other sounds, or do you just want to leave it off as audio? So there is no rule saying that your show must have some type of music within it. However, many podcasters have some type of music at the beginning and then at the end to kind of signify that your show is starting, your show is closing. So we start off with music at the beginning. I showed the levels and how long we allow the music to go for when we fade it out. And then we also use the same music to close out our podcast. There are many websites that have music that you can legally use on your podcast. And so this type of music is usually referred to as royalty-free or stock music that you can use. Try and pick music that kind of goes with your theme, and then also music that will engage with your audience. So music that will go with your theme. So if you're talking about something serious, you might want a little bit more serious music. Our podcast is fairly upbeat. We like to laugh. We like to have a lot of fun. We talk about storytelling, so we use upbeat music. So you really want to think about what kind of music is going to fit with the genre of your podcast. And there's lots of different places to find royalty-free music as well. One of the things that we always do is on our website, we credit the artist. And this is a big thing when you're using even royalty-free music. We want to cite and credit our artists that have created this music for us to use. So that's always really important to do. As well as with your podcast, one thing other than music is you'll want to create some type of cover art for your podcast. So every podcast needs some type of a logo or art to go with it. It's something that signifies it. It's something that can be used on branding, on promotional items, on your website. So this can be usually an image. One thing that it can be is hand-drawn design. It could be a photo of you. It doesn't matter. It's just something that kind of fits or represents your podcast. So for us, the Book Women, what we have is a teacup, and this signifies sitting around together, drinking tea, and being Indigenous women and telling stories. So that's why we chose the teacup. Tanya drew this image for us, so we can use it without having to worry about any type of licensing or using stock images or anything like that. And some of the tools that you can use to create these images are things like Canva. And Canva, you can have a pro account or you can have a free account. So this is my, not my work Canva, but my own Canva. And you can see here even a photo of our teacup with the beaded flowers, and this is for our Facebook here. So you can create different things for different social media as well as for logos within Canva, and it just makes it as a really easy platform for kind of adding things together, overlaying things, and adding designs. So this is one of the tools that we use for that. Additionally, with this, ideally, this is kind of the size and the specs that you want to stick for with your artwork, because it'll help with directories like Apple Podcasts, iTunes, anything like that, for actually adding your image to those sites when they are hosting your podcast. And so one of the things that normally is that your artwork will often be viewed by potential listeners in much more of a smaller format. So you don't want to be cluttering your cover art with a bunch of details, because then it won't translate into these smaller sizes. So it should be clearly readable when it's only 200 px wide. So ours is a fairly simple design. It's not overly messy, and it's something that we can use and kind of manipulate in the ways that we need. So next is podcast hosting. So there's two different things. There's places that you can host your podcast, and then there's directories where actually podcasts and shows live. And they're two different things, but they have slightly similar functions, or can have slightly similar functions. So for podcast hostings, when it comes to getting your podcast out there for everyone to hear, you'll need to have some type of podcast hosting account, often called sometimes called a media host. And that's what these sites are called. So media or podcast hosts are services that store your audio for your listeners to listen, download, or subscribe to your podcast. So for us, we use Anchor for this, but there's other services like Buzzsprout, Captivate, Castos, Podbean, Simplecast, things like that. One of the things too is that with Anchor, we can connect those podcasts to our website. So we do list all of our podcasts on our website. And that's how we also link to our social media, is generally through our website platform. So this is what Anchor looks like. I'll just click on it. Oops, there we go. So this is what Anchor looks like. So Anchor is a site that allows you to distribute, monetize your podcast, and Anchor is free. Anchor is also connected to Spotify, so then you can easily connect up your stuff to Spotify app after. And so with Anchor, there's lots of different tools for exactly how to use it, how to set everything up, demos, and then also, how to get started. You can create your account. So Anchor is really great. You can also use things like Podbean or Podpage, sorry. So this is Podpage, and this is what Podpage looks like. It's a lot like when Spotify also looks similar to this. If you're using a Spotify, if you have your things on Spotify and you're using Anchor, we are on Spotify as well, but this is Podpage. And so what it allows for is a place to kind of put everything. So this is for the podcast studies. And you can see here all the recent episodes with the show notes. It also links to other places to listen. So, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, all the different things. Gives you kind of an introduction to what the podcast is, and then also connects up to their social medias. So we do not have necessarily a podcast page. We have our own website that we pay for, and we've worked on. And then after you have your podcast hosting, and through kind of a podcast host or a media host, we have to publish our website, our podcast, to other places, so that it's not just simply in one place. So what you need to do is you need to upload your audio file to a podcast hosting platform so that it's stored on the web. Then with the help of your hosting platform, you register your podcast with other directories. And then after those directories will handle the distribution. So well, the host handles the delivery. So some podcasts that you can publish with are like Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio. So these are the big ones. So the host, it kind of handles the delivery and the transfer of the audio, whereas the directory allows for a place for your podcast to sit and distributes it to kind of the masses. So that's the difference. And they work together. So you have to have the host, and then you have your podcast directory where folks can find your stuff. As well with having a show, it's really important, we have clean audio, we have our recordings, but also what we want to give folks are podcast show notes. So show notes are often in-depth accounts of what happened during the show and additional resources. So there are websites out there that allow for you to create show notes. Like I said, Podpage, which we just looked at, a podcast allows for really great show notes to be uploaded. If you have your own website as well, you can post your own show notes to your website or your blog. So I'll show you an example of what this kind of looks like. So this is Red Bad Laughing's website. And you can see here, he has a link to the recording. You can see kind of his introduction on what exactly the show is going to be about, the recording, and then you have your show notes here. So these are his show notes. They're quite small. If we take a look at masinahikan iskwêwak, so this is our own webpage for the Book Women podcast. So what we can do is if we go to season 2, let's take a look at this. So what we have here under is our episode right there, as well as a very brief introduction and some show notes, additional links, things that we talked about during the show. Additionally, if you go to our news, we have a little bit more of an extensive note synopsis, kind of a blog about what exactly happened. So here, this is talking about our book club. So when we read Empire of the Wild, this is more information about the book and exactly kind of like a recap of the book and what we talked about, as well as how we add information to this on how to participate in the book club when we were doing it. And so you can see here more information about the different books that we read. And additionally, we did have about not just the book club. So you can see season 3 book club, but here, so picture books with Gabrielle Lamontagne. So here is just some information about our talk with Gabrielle and what we were doing with her, and more information, as well as a photo of one of her paintings, one of her lovely paintings. So that's kind of what your show notes can look like, and they can be set up in different forms depending on how you want to set it up. And then promotion. Promotion is kind of the last stage of our podcasting experience and setting up your podcast. So promotion can be fairly simple. Promotion can also be very extensive. Promotion is very important, though, when you are podcasting. We want people to listen to our podcast. We want our podcast to be found. So the best way to start promoting a new podcast is to make your family and friends listen to it. Because one thing as well is our family and our friends are sometimes our best and our worst critics. Often our family and friends were the first people to listen to the Book Women podcast and to tell us what they actually thought about the podcast. Our family and friends, we heavily relied on as well for support with the podcast and with just kind of getting it started and the setup of it. So we also use a lot of social media within podcasting. So things like Twitter, Facebook, as well as there are podcasts that have now moved on to things like TikTok. Occasionally within Twitter and Facebook, we do put additional information on what's going on, updates about the podcast, trying to hype people up for starting to think about the next episodes, or kind of giving glimpses on who our guests might be, taking people along the journey of kind of how we were recording. So often on our Twitter, or we would post photos of us actually out on site if we were recording on site, or photos of us over Zoom, trying to get people enticed to actually listen to the episodes when we put them out. We haven't gotten into TikTok. I have my own personal TikTok, but I do love seeing podcasters on TikTok talking about their episodes, talking about their experience, or with guests that they might have on the show. You can use services like Hootsuite to link your social media accounts. This can be important, especially if you're running a lot of social media accounts at one time. And then also public events. Public events can be really important, especially when you become a little bit more prominent in podcasting. So for us, the Book Women, we had the opportunity to present twice at LitFest in Edmonton, and this gave us an opportunity to get the podcast out there. So we interviewed authors when we were there for LitFest, as well as we interviewed Rick Hart from Media Indigena as one of the events. And then later Media Indigena did a live recording of a podcast that they were recording for LitFest. So doing public events is something that usually comes a little bit later as your podcast is getting more traction, but it can be really important for taking your podcast to the next step, for trying to think about getting people to fund you, for thinking about collaborating with other podcasters. So there are other considerations, though, to podcasting. And especially when we're starting up, it's really important if you're doing a podcast and you're working with other folks. So if there's multiple people doing a podcast at one time and you have co-hosting, we want to split up the duties. So one thing that I would suggest doing is sitting down, starting a doc, starting a Google Doc, or even having, a day where you sit down together and you have the whiteboard, you have some type of piece of paper. Really think about everybody's skills, what they bring to the table, and really clearly defining folks' duties for setting up the podcast. Podcasting does take a lot of time, but it needs to be shared responsibilities. So like I said, Tanya and Sheila are really great at doing the audio and doing the editing. I do much more of the marketing for the podcast. I run the social medias, so more of the kind of public facing, as well as doing things like monitoring our email and setting up for when we were doing a lot more of public promotion of the podcast. We shared in the duties of contacting guests, as we mostly relied on a lot of friends or individuals that we knew for the first few seasons. And it can take a lot of time to coordinate external guests as well. And kind of setting up a schedule was something that we shared in the responsibility. One thing that we did, and this was kind of building on our relationships for the podcast, is we always allowed our guests to listen to the recording before it was published. So this was because we wanted to be respectful of what guests were saying. Sometimes guests would say things and then be like, oh, I want that edited out. That shouldn't have actually been said, and that's fine. We always want guests to be able to have their autonomy and to maintain that and to maintain good relationships with it. So we always allowed guests to listen to the audio before we actually published it. Because of the nature of the Book Women and some folks' podcasts, we have to be aware of cultural red tape. So we did one episode, and an example of this would be we did one episode on pre-storytelling, and we had Josh Littlechild on the show. He talked about Wasaki-Chuck stories, which are stories that are only allowed to be shared within the winter. And this is kind of a cultural protocol. So one thing that we did is that in consultation with Josh and from his understanding, we made it so that it sounded like it was snowing within the recording. And you can hear kind of like, it sounds like snow. So that it's always snowing within the audio, and it makes it seem like we can get past that cultural red tape because it sounds like it's snowing. This was one thing that we had to think really creatively about, is how do we share this in a way that it's always going to be live, but adheres to that protocol. Another thing that we could have done is just taken down that recording until the winter time, but recordings are out there, they exist in multiple places, so that would have just been too much for us. One thing that you can do is podcast guesting. And so podcast guesting is when you visit other folks' podcasts, they come on yours. So it's kind of sharing between podcasts as a guest. And I did link here kind of a guide to podcast guesting and appearing as a guest on other folks' podcasts. And so this can be really important for kind of building your following, as well as building relationships with other podcasters. as well as podcast festivals are always really great to attend or participate in, as you can kind of build a network with other podcasters in your area, so locally or nationally, and see what's going on in the world of podcasts. So new trends, new tools that folks are using, and just building kind of that podcasting community. As well as we can apply for grants. Grant applying is something that it takes a lot of skill to write grants. It can take a lot of time to write grants. And a lot of time grants are on a schedule. So often you have to keep your eye out or put them in a calendar on when grants are being released. But they're a great way to make money so that you can do things like pay yourself, pay your guests, buy equipment for podcasting if you don't have access to those materials as well. And then lastly, we can think about merch. Is merch really worth it? We have never published or produced merch for the Book Women. That's kind of the last thing on our mind. However, we did talk about creating merch when we were doing things like attending podcasting festivals. However, putting that additional funding and money into a podcast when there's other things that you could be spending money on is kind of that last step. So that's when your podcast actually makes it and, you know, it's taken off and everybody is listening to your podcast. That's when you get merch so that you can see people walking around with, you know, your teacup like we have on a t-shirt, or people recognize, recognize your brand, your logo out there in public. So merch is kind of that last thing that we want to think about. There's lots of other things to think about in podcasting before actually getting physical items and like swag out there to people. And that is it for me today. So thank you very much. Thanks for having me here for this workshop. And I will share all the resources with everybody. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. My Twitter is at @AuntyLibrarian, AUNTY librarian. And that's probably the easiest way. Direct message me, keep up to date on what's going on in library land and in podcasting. Also, the Book Women are on social media as well. So you can look at our social medias, keep up to date on what we're up to as well. And thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, thank you.
Stop the recording now.
Perfect.